Blog Talk Radio. Blog Talk
Radio. Hello, everyone in the franchise world. My name is Paul Segreto, and this is Franchise Today. Another exciting segment of Franchise Today is in store for you, as today my guest will be Tom Spadea, a business and franchise attorney and former franchise executive. Tom and I will be discussing the nuts and bolts of landlord and lender negotiations and how the same, done effectively, improves the chances of franchise success. And, of course, I'm here today with my co-producer, Joe Caruso from Havre de Grace, Maryland. Joe, welcome to Franchise Today.
Well, Paul, thank you for the introduction, but I need to correct you. The pronunciation of the town that I live in requires a couple of preconditions. One is you have to pretend that French were never invented, and you have to talk like a hillbilly. It's Havre de Grace. So just think Havre de Grace. And it's always lovely when I order something online or I have to provide my street address and the name of my town because I always have to spell it. And the street that I live on is complicated as well. It's called Timonium, and no one can seem to spell Timonium either. But just think Beverly Hillbillies and forget that French were a language.
There you go. I could imagine people saying, okay, Havre de Grace, so that's half the grace, okay, and you live on a street named for the new metal in golf clubs, Timonium. Anyway, I'm glad we could have a little lighthearted moment on Franchise Today. Joe, you know, last week we had a great show. We had Deb Evans, the CEO of Computer Explorers and one of the organizers of Fran Camp. And as you know, I participated in Fran Camp in Nashville, Tennessee last Saturday. It was a live event, basically a workshop type event on social media for franchising. It was well attended in the Nashville area. We had some great barbecue at Jack's Barbecue. There was some great speakers there, of course. Former guests on the show, B.J. Emerson from Tasty Delight, Jack Monson from Engage One-to-One, of course, Deb Evans as well. And there was other new players on there, Jenny McDonald from Win Home Inspection, A.K. Stout from Saying It's Social. Thomas Scott talked about blogging and SEO. Joe Matthews from the Franchise Performance Group was there. A couple of great speakers, local speakers about SEO that I hadn't met before. Great information. All in all, it was a good event. And certainly look forward to future events. And there's a lot, there's not a lot going on in the franchising world right now. We've just come out of the Franchise Update Media Group Leadership Conference in Atlanta. I heard some good things about that. Next week, right after the show, I'll be heading out to Los Angeles, and I'll be at the West Coast Franchise Expo. I handled all the social media for MFE Expos leading into this event, as well as Franchise Expo South in January and International Franchise Expo next June. Looking forward to seeing a lot of people in the franchise community. And speaking about next week, Joe, who do we have next week on November 3rd on Franchise Today?
Well, we have Michael Webster, and he's going to do a recap of the American Bar Association Forum on Franchising conference that was held here in Baltimore, Maryland, last week. And our guest Tom Spadea was an attendee of that event. And I talked with Michael this morning. He's excited about reviewing a lot of the content and giving people a look-see into what occurred at the meeting and what was news that franchisors need to be aware of in the legal realm.
And, of course, Michael Webster has been on Franchise Today in a couple of our legal series and is a well-known franchisee attorney out of Toronto, Canada, and also the strategic chair of the International Association of Franchisees and Dealers, and I'm proud to announce my supplier membership within the IAFT. as I spend more and more time working with franchisees and franchise groups. And, of course, I thank you, Joe, for introducing me to Michael Webster.
Well, it was my pleasure, and Mike is a good friend and a good friend of franchising, and he started the IAFD with a good friend of mine from my days at Hardee's, Steve Ellerhorst, who unexpectedly passed this year. But the IAFD is a terrific organization, and I'm glad I was able to make that introduction.
Yeah, and we had Steve Ellerhorst on the show in the past, and quite a loss for franchising, as you said, unexpected, and I know franchising and the IAFD will certainly miss him. Definitely looking forward to hearing what Michael has to say next week. And then the week after, the following 2 weeks, who do we have on Franchise Today?
Well, we've got Shelley Sun, and she's the president and CEO of Brightstar. And Shelley has just published a book, and we're going to let her tell us about what's in her book about franchising and about her experience in developing her company. Shelley was also the star of the Undercover Boss episode on broadcast TV, and she might give us a little bit of the inside scoop on what occurred in her participation with the reality TV show, which should be very interesting. And then we're on to a very interesting show with our guest Mark Fidgman, and he's an attorney, and his topic is HR challenges for franchisees and franchisors. Why should you care about tattoos, Facebook, and the end of the alphabet? And in previewing what we're going to be talking about with Mark, it's very compelling and very interesting. It is a brave new world when you combine social media with HR issues. The landscape has changed entirely, and I think it's going to be very, very interesting to learn how tattoos and Facebook and the alphabet all are intertwined.
Yeah, definitely looking forward to all three of our upcoming shows, and then, of course, we'll be going into the Thanksgiving break. We have a couple of shows we're trying to iron out for the few weeks in December that we'll be broadcasting before the holiday break as well. So certainly exciting times on Franchise Today. And Joe, you know, we have Tom Spadea today on Franchise Today. He's got a wealth of experience. Starting out in the franchise industry as a franchise and business broker for Sunbelt of Philadelphia, acting as an advisor to clients looking to transition into ownership of a franchise or the purchase of an existing small business. He handled dozens of transactions a year, from listing businesses for sale, recruiting buyers, negotiating transactions, all to the satisfaction of the stakeholders. His corporate experience in franchise includes senior exec positions for multiple franchise concepts, including Salad Works, Hunting and Learning Centers, Reader's Water Ice, which, of course, is a retail chain of franchise frozen dessert restaurants. And then after more than 15 years of corporate and entrepreneurial experience, he went on to receive a law degree at Temple University's Beasley School of Law in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. His undergrad degree was in finance from Marquette in Milwaukee. And just a wealth of experience in franchising, and certainly somewhat, I guess, unusual to make the change from the corporate side to the legal side, and I'm anxious to hear about that. And also, he was awarded the Certified Franchise Executive distinction in February 2008 from our friends at the International Franchise Association. He's got a patent as well. And, of course, I welcome Tom Spadea to Franchise Today. Welcome, Tom.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Joe. I appreciate it. Thank you. Thanks for having me. Certainly looking forward to it, and chatting about everything. And you kind of said it. You're right. I've sort of swam in a different direction. Many attorneys start as attorneys and end up on the business side, and I've kind of gone in the opposite direction.
Yeah, it definitely is interesting, and you're a relatively new franchise attorney, but certainly not new to franchising. I mean, why make the change from franchise development to franchise and transactional law?
Well, I guess to some degree what I've seen, and when I was on the corporate side, I dealt with a lot of attorneys. When you're in the transaction side, you deal with a lot of attorneys. And, to some degree, I think the role of a franchise attorney, or certainly a transactional attorney, is to get deals done and to really narrow down to the most important issues and convince the other side of why it's important and why everybody's going to win here. And I don't think there's there's a lot of similarities maybe to doing development and being an attorney. And I think I bring a perspective to my clients, and I have a passion for it. I really do. I mean, I was actually telling my daughter, boy, it's great. It took me a while in life to find out exactly where I should be and what I want to do, but I'm there, and I enjoy it. And when you enjoy what you do and you like what you work, it doesn't feel as much like work.
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly, if you love what you do. I've seen that a lot out there on Facebook and the various social media platforms that I tend to frequent, and people say that, if you love it, it really is not work, and I'm a firm believer in that, and of course love doing what I do day in and day out, and I guess, it's easy to say or safe to say that you saw business opportunity in providing franchise legal services, and certainly there's no shortage of attorneys generally, or even franchise attorneys specifically. What is your niche? Which communities do you intend to serve? Is it franchisors, franchisees, or both?
It's really both, and I get asked that question a lot. And I, as a business broker and then as a development executive, I obviously had tremendous amount of time I've spent with entrepreneurs who were, developing this with, sort of a different bent. You were dealing with them to get to the goal of development. And when I sort of made that switch over to the attorney side, what I like is I can develop, real relationships with my clients. And I got started thinking I'm really going to focus on franchisee transactions. And so I've had my firm now coming up on a year anniversary in Thanksgiving. And what I found is some franchisors have come to me and said, look, can you look at our item 19? Can you look at this? And can you help us with some best practices? And I've done lease work on both sides of the angle, and so really it's project work. And I think franchising is such a interesting. I love it because you're dealing with it's not a linear relationship. It's a 3 parties or 4 parties and a bank and a landlord, the franchisor's needs, the franchisee's needs, and just balancing all of these different agendas, but really trying to get to that common goal of, making money and making people secure. So I don't, consider myself either side. And I think the more work I do with franchisors and I can understand, and I guess, I've been in sales and I've done development, and I know you're most effective when you listen more and you have empathy and you understand the needs of the other party and you can get them where they need to go or get your client or the side you're representing. So the more work I do with franchisors, the better I can service franchisees, and vice versa. The more I understand what franchisors need, the better I can serve franchisees. So my goal is really to be on both sides. I don't think you should pigeonhole yourself.
Very interesting. Joe, I know you had a specific question about the state of franchising for Tom. While I change mics, why don't you please discuss that with Tom?
Well,
and there you are. Are you there, Joe?
Here we go.
Yes, you have to take the mute button off before you start talking.
That would help.
You were practicing your French pronunciations again, I guess.
And it sounded great to me. Unfortunately, the only person that could hear it was me. Tom and I, you have had numerous conversations about franchising, the economy, franchise sales, best practices. And maybe you can give some of the perspectives we've talked about, maybe some new perspectives that you have with regard to the current state of the economy, what's happening with franchisors, and maybe look at it from kind of a stratified kind of perspective in the $50,000 to $100,000 investments that are home based versus the greater than $100,000 that are real estate based to the capital intensive $1 million plus land building and equipment kinds of franchises. Who's selling? Why are they selling? And what has the economic impact been with the recession?
Well, it's I always think you're right when you say you stratify, but I would actually go and divide it up even to, I think what you're seeing in franchising is a separation between strong concepts and weak concepts. And I think now more than ever it has gone back to the age-old most important thing, which is unit economics. And I think that's whether you're at a $50,000 to $100,000 investment or you're at $1 million plus investment. There has been a real popping of that overly optimistic people. I mean, there are still some concepts, they get on fire and everybody just, checks the rationale at the door and runs into it. But I think what you've seen in the last couple of years is people be a lot more conservative. So what that has done is it has driven maybe some of the buyers in the traditional, $200,000 to $300,000 QSR down to the $50,000 and $100,000 investments, more because they're thinking, hey, I'm a little bit more risk averse. I'm not going to take that risk. I don't want to put up my house if I lose this investment. So what I've seen is people asking the question, what if I fail? Then what happens? And I think you go back 3 years ago, people didn't ask that question, and you would tell them, hey, this is how you get out of it. Hey, I'm never going to fail. So there's been a little bit more of that conservative, which, quite frankly, I think is good for the franchising. I think it's good for business. And so you're seeing more of these $100,000 investments going below. But the reality is there's a lot of activity this year, and I think some franchises are selling a lot, even in the bigger. And we'll talk about lending. I think lending softened up. It's also a barbell. You have all the banks competing, just like all the franchisors are competing for the best candidates, and the ones who can't compete, whose unit economics are weak, are the ones who are really suffering. So I'd say the state of franchising for the strong systems are great, and for the weaker systems are really struggling and have to go back to basics and fix their underlying model.
So you're thinking that, like, the quality.
Yeah, I think the quality, and I think the quality reflected in, earnings. I think that's an important thing. So I think people are much more, I think franchisees are more conservative today than they were by everything that they see around them. So I think the state of franchising for the brands that are growing and are having some success, it's a real good market for them because there are buyers. The uncertainty, as it traditionally always does, uncertainty does drive buyers. People feel, hey, if I own a business, which is why ultimately I have a passion and love franchising, I think you're a lot more secure having a franchisee-franchisor relationship than having a boss and getting laid off. So those buyers are still out there, but they're just a little bit more conservative, and they've gotten a lot more show me, let me see it, let me do that validation. I was talking to a franchise broker last night, actually, at a franchising event, saying that the other thing he's noticing, because I always ask that question, what's the state, is the sales cycle is taking a lot longer, is you have to give a little bit more patience to the buyers as opposed to fill out this form, come in here, sign the deal. I think you're seeing people take a lot longer to make that decision. Maybe they're going to call, double the amount of franchisees that they would have called in the past. So people are sort of trusting but verifying, whereas in the past maybe they just trusted and just ran into it.
Yes, certainly in today's economic environment, franchise buyers, and of course this could relate to consumers as well, are definitely more diligent and more cautious and anxious than ever before, and also being more sophisticated, educated, and technologically advanced than ever before. They're certainly spending more and more time online, and I do agree with his statement with respect to the buying cycle, the amount of time it takes, because they're doing so much research online that, and as you might know, I do a lot of work with franchise development and using social media as a way to integrate with traditional processes and procedures. And the big disconnect is coming out of the digital world and into the real world. And I know Joe presented at the Franchise Social Media Summit last month about that topic, that transition from the digital world to the real world. And there's often a disconnect, and it's because that old sales process that started at letter A and ended in letter Z was very regimented. It followed a natural progressive order of, somebody seeing an ad in Franchise Handbook or in the Franchise 500 and calling up the company and saying, hey, I'm interested in some franchise information, and they put a 4-color brochure in a big envelope and sent it to them, and then waited 3 or 4 days and called them up and asked them questions and sent them a request for consideration and walked through the process. And oftentimes now the potential franchise buyer, the interested party, might actually engage with the representative company, but he already might be at letter P and had already done so much due diligence and so much research to that point. So, yeah, the process is definitely taking longer, and the candidate is definitely demanding more and more information and is also willing to do a lot more. My philosophy, too, is if you look at the last recession or one of the recessions, and specifically I refer back to the 80s into the 90s. Remember the oil bust down here in Texas, and we had a lot of franchise candidates that had just ridden the wave of getting 16 and 17% return on their money market, and they had a nice little nest egg built up, and they said, you know what? I'm willing to get into a business and use these gains to get into a business because I know I still have my principal. And today, nowadays, people's principal has been withered away some, and certainly when they make an investment at this point, they're more curious, they're more cautious, they're more concerned. That even though they know that there's always the potential and risk that a lot of them have told me, in the past, I could have dealt with it because I was dealing with gains, but today, failure is not an option. So it definitely is a new world, an economic environment that is much different than I think we've ever seen before.
Yeah, and I, there's an opportunity there for franchisors, however, to capitalize on that if they can understand it and engage and communicate. It's sort of like, right, it goes back to basics. It becomes really about the relationship you can build and then trusting. It all comes back to trust. If things go bad, is that franchisor going to be with me?
Yeah, and it's definitely a changing world. I know Joe and I were both privileged to be invited to the Small Business Lending Summit that the IFA helped promote back in February, or actually it was in April, right after the International Franchise Expo in Washington. And it's interesting the perspective that lenders are taking right now, and as you mentioned so eloquently about unit economics. These lenders are looking at unit economics, and they're looking at, the sales figures. They're looking at, P&L statements, and they're looking at things and saying, even though you have, 20 franchises over here all doing well, you have one that's doing bad. How do I know as a lender that I lend money to this franchisee and I might be faced with him being that one or two people that are underperforming? Where does that leave me? So it's definitely being looked at so differently, and the way it's impacting franchising today? And specifically, how does this all, with what I mentioned about, these lenders and stuff like that, how do you see this all impacting, the leasing environment?
Well, certainly the leasing environment, there are opportunities there. However, it all depends. It's very regionalized, and I deal with a lot of franchisees and a lot of franchisors in different parts of the country, so you really see it. If you're negotiating a lease in, Las Vegas or South Florida, you're going to get a little bit of a different tack than somewhere maybe, in my hometown here in Philadelphia. I think the impact is, I think landlords are starting to get a little bit, it all depends. Like we said about it depends on the franchisor. It also depends on the landlord and the space. Good spaces, there's not so many deals out there. So I think you can get, but landlords themselves have had their own problems financing. So it's not always as easy, to get the landlords to come up with the big, tenant improvement and the TI money, if they're hurting or if they're in a position where they have some vacancies in their centers. I think it's a good time to go out and get space. There is a lot of real estate out there, although I've seen it tighten up in the last year. And it depends what you're asking for. There are definitely landlord opportunities. I actually think there are more lender and banking opportunities, believe it or not. I think the banks are becoming more competitive against one another because there are, everybody talks about there being no money out there, and I actually don't think that's the case. I think it's the fact that there's not as many good deals out there. So if you are one of those good deals and you've positioned yourself where you can get financing, you can get really inexpensive money, and banks will beat themselves up over those deals because there's just not as many good deals out there. So I think there's tremendous opportunities in the lending environment, and with the leasing environment and the work I do with franchisors and franchisees, you just see more latitude with those third parties. They're not as take it or leave it because you don't get the sense that there's three people behind you that if you don't sign that lease, they're going to take it. So that just puts you in a better negotiating position to get what you want and to get some of the key important points, understanding the business points for both sides.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And certainly jumping up and down and stamping your feet is not one of those ways of doing it. Joe, you and I have had numerous conversations about, franchise best practices and how it relates to, documents. And we've had several attorneys on, and we've talked about, discovery items. We've talked about e-discovery items. We've talked about, good practical ways of holding on to information. And you and I have talked a lot about, franchise agreements and franchise disclosure compliance. And, basically when it comes down to it, are both groups paying enough attention to the underlying leases and loans? And I know that's a question that you prepared, Joe, as we were preparing for today's show and the discussion with Tom. And why don't you just explain, Tom, a little bit of your thought behind that question and probably phrase it a little bit better than I might have.
Well, I think you've phrased it quite well, and I'll tell you what the genesis of that question is some of my own personal experience in the 20 years I've been in franchising, and having to go back to a franchise file for either a good reason, a renewal, or a bad reason, because you're in a default, potentially a default situation, or you've got a franchisee that's failing, and you need to figure out how do you remedy and mitigate this situation. And you go back and you find out you don't even have a lease, or if you do have a lease, you've got a 10-year franchise agreement with a 15-year lease, or a 10-year franchise agreement with a 5-year lease. I mean, I would bet you dollars to donuts that there are more franchisors that don't have coterminous leases in their system than do. I mean, I should qualify that. There are a lot of franchisors that probably aren't checking to ensure that they have coterminous leases, and that's really important for both the franchisor and the franchisee. A franchisee might actually think, hey, I can get a really good deal if I just sign a 15-year lease. Well, it's not a really, really good deal if you can't operate the business because you're going to be in default of the lease. It's not they might think I should sign a 5-year deal so I can manage my risk, but I've got a 10-year franchise agreement. Well, what if I can't renew? Now I'm going to be in default of my franchise agreement, and then any equity I have in the business has evaporated because I can't continue to operate. Not to mention the potential for liquidated damages and other bad things that can happen from making an early termination. So that was really kind of the thought process, and since Tom's our guest, he can maybe give us more firsthand kind of opinion on these things.
There's a lot of best practices for franchisors that they should do. I mean, you don't even have to go to the coterminous lease to the extreme of the 15-year versus the 5-year. I mean, a lot of franchise agreements are effective the day the franchisee signs it, and then they might sign a lease 9 months later. So now you're dealing with a renewal 10 years from now, and you got to make a decision of do I renew my franchise agreement but maybe I want to move. So now you're not even you're off by 6 to 12 months, and that can be problematic. I mean, it can be managed, but it's just something that I think people don't think about when they're getting into it. That's something I ask for franchisees when they sign a franchise agreement, that hey, we'll adjust the effective date of this thing, within 6 months, and it's a very simple ask. Franchisors usually say, sure, that's fine, I'll make it coterminous, but then that way they can make a decision at the end to get out of the business or move it. Another really important thing you were mentioning about going back to the franchise file. How many franchisors have moved offices in the last 5 to 10 years, downsized or upsized? Probably a bunch, right?
A lot. Yeah.
Well, how many of them have actually pulled out their lease files and changed the notice provision in the lease and gone back to those landlords and said, hey, we're a notice party on this, but we want to make sure that if our franchisee is defaulting, and I was working with a franchisor where the franchisee was getting evicted and they didn't know about it, so I thought, well, you guys, maybe you dropped the ball and you didn't put the notice provision in the lease. No, the lease was 8 years old. They had moved 4 years ago, and nobody told the landlord, who was, out in Ohio, that, hey, when you CC us on these defaults, you have to send it to, and the forwarding had long since expired. So looking at your lease file in these markets, I think, highlights some of those flaws. And, put in the notice provision. Make sure you do that. What happens a lot of times is, the development guys and even the real estate guys, you get to the LOI, you sign the lease, and then the wheels come off of the actual administrative part of it because you didn't sign the lease, the franchisee signed it. Do you really have the copy of the lease in your file? Is it exactly what you agreed to? Is your conditional assignment in there? So I think from a best practices standpoint, you should develop you should have a checklist of, hey, this is what we need to do, and we're not going to approve this thing to open until, I get a copy of the fully executed lease, and I confirm, and I've approved it, and you've sort of built all that stuff into it. A lot of landlords are very sophisticated. Franchising is an enormous percentage of leases that get signed in the retail space. So their understanding of that three-party relationship, but I think you have to make it easy for the landlord as well. I think a best practice, you talk about best practices, is to have a bullet points on a grid of must-haves. Here is what you have to have to fulfill your obligations as a franchisee, things in terms of use. Use clause is a good one, right? Not to get too far in the weeds here, but here's one that franchisors sometimes will overlook. How long are you committing to this space, and what are you going to potentially add? Are we going to add coffee? Are we going to add this? Are we going to add dessert if we're a QSR? Is my use clause broad enough to basically have that tail at the end that says, or any, product as prescribed by the franchisor? Or am I going to roll something out and hit a wall because, 25% of my leases had a very, very narrow use clause of what I'm selling today, and that's going to be a big problem. So that's a best practice.
Tom, interrupting a minute. That is a good point, because there's a lot of, mall-based pretzel operations that, were really kind of one-dimensional kind of businesses selling, some, salty pretzels and some sweet pretzels, and now they're making, hot dogs wrapped in pretzel dough. Well,
right.
They had a lot of problems with some of their leases because their use clauses didn't allow them to do that.
That's right. And if they signed in a market like this, where they signed a really low rent, landlords who, I deal with a lot of landlords, and they're not afraid to say, oh, you want to change your use clause? Sure. Why don't we revisit this or revisit that? So, they're not afraid to play hard. We all beat on them in these markets, so in good markets they're going to beat right back to us. So that's an important one, often overlooked.
And your idea of a checklist is an excellent idea. It's been very effective for me to use checklists, but I've taken it actually one step further. You take the checklist, and once the franchise agreement is signed, once the lease is signed, using a CRM-type system or a CMS-type system, creating an abstract of both that franchise agreement with the key things that are on that would be on a similar checklist, and more importantly, with the lease, taking those key components, those the escalation, the CAMs, and of course who the landlord is, and being able to go to your computer system and not have to pull the file to get that lease abstract, to get that franchise abstract.
Right. So I think a best practice for that is a good, but I mean, even in the negotiation part, best practices are to have these bullet points that are must-haves and then nice-to-haves, and then a franchisee who presumably is going to hire a local real estate attorney or a national, real estate attorney. There's lots of guys that do what I do that negotiate that. It's real nice when the franchisor hands you a list and says, hey, make sure all this stuff's in the lease. Okay, that's fine. So that can go in my first revision. Because landlords sometimes get upset is that we'll be negotiating this lease, right? And then the franchisor gets the lease at the third or fourth revision, or maybe they got it at the first one and they never looked at it. And then they come back and say, oh, well, wait a second. We need all this stuff in here to comply with the franchise agreement. And the landlord says, hey, guys, we're on revision 4 here. We want to get to the finish line. And now you're bringing up some pretty material stuff. That should have been dealt with in, version 1, or ideally that should be dealt with in the LOI and get the agreement, out of the way. Some things like the use clause. The other thing I think that's really important is the assignment language. Go back to, say, QSR, which is a lot of the real estate stuff, and you have a concept that has a $250,000 net worth requirement, but you have a franchisee that's worth, $2 million and doing 10 units. Well, it's important for both the franchisor and for the franchisee, because you want that assignment so that if the guy sells the store, the girl sells the store, they're done. You don't want them part of it anymore with their hands in the pie. You want the new person. So you have to be careful about that assignment language, and franchisors sometimes will overlook that because they don't care. It's not their agreement, but you should put things in there like the net worth, the current net worth of the franchise system, not necessarily this candidate, because this guy might have a lot more money. He might be overqualified, and now you've set the bar that he wants to get out. You bring in a candidate, and the franchise and the landlord is going to resist doing the assignment without further concessions because they don't want to let go of this, heavy hitter versus someone that's kind of more meeting your minimum requirements. So I think assignment language is real important for both franchisors and franchisees to look at. How do we get out of this thing?
Dealing with dealing with franchisees across a bunch of different brands, and of course, as we've already started to beat up today's economy, I often hear from franchisees, well, I see so many empty buildings. I could just walk in and I'm going to confront the landlord and I'm going to demand that he reduce my rent because I'm just having a hard time making it. What do you say to that when you hear such a statement?
Well, It all depends. I mean, I think that there are a lot of concessions that landlords have made, but I think you have to be creative about it because you also have to be sensitive. This comes back to sort of my general philosophy of doing transactions of the needs of the other side. You have some landlords who, let's say you're only a 1,500 square foot use in a very big space, is they don't want to necessarily permanently lower the bar on all of their rentals. So, I think you have to be creative with how you ask for relief so that you're not maybe even running afoul of the landlord's loan covenants. So the landlord has a mortgage, and if his rent rolls drop or his, per square footage drops, they could call the loan. So, sometimes franchisees think, well, I don't understand. I'm paying $3,000 a month, and I'm going to close down. Isn't it better for the landlord to get $1,500 a month? Believe it or not, it depends. Some landlords would rather see a space go dark and just sit on dark space until the economy turns around than necessarily cut the rent so deeply that they're going to really ruin all of their rent rolls, and now they're going to be stuck with that low rent for the next 10 years, and presumably in a couple of years now things will improve. So I think it's a case-by-case basis. I think you have to be very cautious of how you approach the landlord and find out, what you can do to make it work.
I see. And let's take a look at the franchisee lease and loan basics in two parts. And at a minimum, what should franchisors be looking for in their franchisees' lease and loan? And then, of course, what should franchisees pay the closest attention to?
Well, for franchisors, Paul, I think what's super important is the notice provisions, both in the lease and the loan documents. Is you want to make sure that you are notified of everything. Because right there, at the end, you don't pay the loan, you're going to have a lot of trouble. You don't pay your landlord, you're going to have a lot of trouble. We can, as attorneys, go in and work on and squeeze and negotiate the best terms. But I think from a franchisor's perspective, the notice provision is probably the single most important thing so that they find out everything that's going on with their franchisee's lease and with their franchisee's loan so they can kind of get in front of problems. The other things for franchisors I think that is important is that assignment language that I was talking about before and the use clauses to maintain the flexibility so that they can expand their own market and the exclusivity. Franchisees might not care about that, but you got to look real hard to try to negotiate or get your franchisee to negotiate a strong exclusivity so you can keep competitors out of that same, say you're in a shopping center or something like that. So I think that's really important for the franchisor side. From the franchisee side, I think the personal guarantee is probably the most important thing to be looked at. I mean, you're talking about a single-purpose business entity. If it's a retail franchise and things go horribly wrong and you're not paying your rent, the value of your equipment, it's going to be collateralized, most likely to the bank, so that doesn't matter. So I think you want to limit that personal guarantee. That's going to be your most important thing. How do I work my way out of this thing and pull out of it without with the least amount of pain? So you start with, can I get a 1-year rolling guarantee, or can I cap it at $100,000 is the most that you're going to be able to come back against me personally. That's going to be your most important. From a loan standpoint, for the franchisee, well, it's really the same thing on the personal guarantee, but there are SBA guidelines, so there's only so much you can do. So I think you have to be prepared. If you're a franchisee and you own your house and you have tons of equity in your house, before you ever even fill out that loan and go for the SBA loan, there's not much you're going to be able to negotiate in terms of those documents, because when you have, especially with an SBA, when you have that SBA guarantee, a lot of those things will just flow through, and they're the standard operating procedures. But, if you have a credit line on your house, maybe that you're not even using, but it's in position and it collateralizes and gobbles up equity, if there's less than 25% equity in your house, the SBA may not then put a lien on that. So there are some structural things that you have to look at of when you're borrowing money to help yourself out as a franchisee. As a franchisor, I mean, that there's you just want them really to get the money. That's the key.
In your experience as an attorney and a franchise executive, and certainly just a tremendous advantage being able to look at it from both perspectives, what are some of the most common lease and loan negotiation errors that are made?
I think the most common lease negotiation error for franchisors is a lease gets signed without, in the rush to get this guy moving through the process, we didn't stop and think. And if you have, which most franchisors is a best practice, have the collateral assignment, whereas if something happens and blows up, you have the right to step in there. And what I've seen happen more than once is that you make an error and you don't get in there and do that. And so the lease comes back and it's fully executed and you're not a party to that agreement. And that's a real problem. That's a real problem for you as a franchisor. Now, what are you going to do? Are you going to undo it? Are you going to default the franchisee? Are you going to not let him open because of the fact that he might fail 5 years from now and we want to be in a better position? So I think that's a real common error. The other thing is I mentioned before about the notice and not really being on top of what leases you have out there, having your files truly buttoned up and in there. Another error I think you see in lease negotiation, and I'll put my business hat on less than my attorney hat, is franchisees fall in love with a location and they stop looking at every other location, and that's a big error, and that's an error in general negotiation, whether you're going for a loan or going for a lease. You should always have 2 or 3 balls in the air, bringing them all towards the finish line. It's not a done deal until it is signed. And if emotionally you have sort of a good alternative, a secondary alternative in your back pocket that is, not ideal but acceptable, you'll be in a much better position when the landlord says, no, that's a deal killer. We're not giving you we're not going to give you the collateral assignment of lease, and or we're not going to give you the rolling guarantee, or the loan just says, no, I'm sorry, we need everybody to do that on the personal guarantee, and we're gonna exercise this, and we're gonna need this, that, and the other. If you don't have a backup plan, if you haven't thought, geez, how else could I pull this off? Especially in these times with so much uncertainty, you don't know what's going to happen. I always get frustrated when I hear clients saying, no, it has to be this one. It has to be done. It puts you in a difficult situation negotiating, knowing that if the other side says this is a deal killer and you're not prepared to say, well, it's a deal killer for us too, I'm sorry, you got to back down, then you're faced with making a really tough business decision and potentially getting into a relationship that hasn't put you in the best situation.
Very,
so
very interesting. Yeah, that's definitely interesting. Deal killers and emotions and passionate about the the space. Certainly, all key areas that come up time and time again. And you bring up a great point of being in love with the location and basically putting on the blinders and not looking at other ones. And it's not always the most prudent way to go. And
another thing that just came to my mind. Another thing I think that is a very common lease mistake is the timing of getting open. And franchisees and franchisors are sometimes overly optimistic about the timing and the permit period, and that's an area that you really need to pay attention to. And don't do it, do it on your worst case, not on your best case. You're trying to get open. It's in everybody's best interest. But if you don't get this permit or this thing holds up, when's your rent commencement date? The last thing you want to do is paying rent in an unfinished space. So that's another big mistake people make very often.
Yeah, definitely the case. Definitely the case. I've seen it all too often. Okay, moving along in the process. So, Tom, if I'm a franchisee, I have a failing unit with a very burdensome lease and loan that I, can't possibly cover. What approaches can I make to improve the situation?
Well, Sign of the Times has done a lot of that work. And I'll tell you the number one mistake that franchisees make is they put their head in the sand. And they couldn't hurt themselves more. That is probably the biggest mistake that franchisees make, is they're stressed out. They know that this loan, they can never pay it the way they've been paying it, and they stop communicating. I had breakfast with a banker this morning, actually, and that topic came up, and he said, hey, we're big boys. We understand when these things have to be renegotiated, but what we don't like is we don't start getting phone calls back, and we're calling people, and they're blowing us off, and they're not telling us what the plan is. We know what their financials look like, and we see the writing on the wall. Let's all get out of this thing. And when they have to start hiring lawyers, it unravels. So I think the most important thing is communication and just being very upfront with both the lenders and the landlord of saying, hey, here's my situation. I'm doing X amount in sales. Here's what's dropping to the bottom line. I have a big problem here. If I keep going as normal, I'm going to go dark. I can either, and then I think they have to make a decision of, do they want to see it through? And I think if they want to see it through, that's when you go to the landlord and you put a reasonable offer on the table to renegotiate some rent relief. But you have to be real careful. I never like when landlords add it on the back end, because that's not necessarily solving the problem. And with the loans, with the SBA, you can typically get a 6-month deferment and pay interest only. That's, something franchisees should be able to do on their own. They don't need an attorney to do that. And but it's that lack of communication that's a real big problem. And then you have to have a plan. Am I just buying time, or do I have a real plan? And I've talked often about this, is that, the ultimate plan, franchisees they feel that they have no place to turn if they have a $300,000 loan and their business is breaking even or losing a little bit of money. You go to a business broker, and the business broker says, I can't sell this. I'm sorry. Maybe the equipment's worth $50,000 or less. But if you reposition it and you go to the landlord and you say, I'm going to sell this, and a new person comes in and they spend $75,000 to reopen it, the bank will be agreeable to get out of it for a little bit over asset value, and the new buyer will come in maybe even in a strong cash flow position because they won't have that debt. That's an important thing for franchisors, because you keep the store open. I mean, it's difficult because every location is unique. The franchisee, there's always a backstory. There's always something going on. But the most important thing is not to put your head in the sand, not to just ignore the bank, to call them up and say, here's the situation. We got to go one of two ways. And also call the franchisor. I think franchisors don't like to have their head in the sand. And here's the best practice you were asking. If you're a franchisor, you should know who those folks are. You should have your own metrics to know, hey, this guy's been late on royalty a couple times, or look at his numbers compared to everybody else. Look at his cost structure compared to everybody else. And, of course, if you've done a good job with your bank documents and your lease documents, you've been notified every time he's been late on the lease or the loan. And you can then call him up and say, look, this is an uncomfortable conversation, but what's your game plan here? If we keep going in this direction, you're going to go dark. You're going to have your personal guarantees triggered. You're going to have us chasing you, the bank chasing you, and the landlord chasing you. Why don't we help you? Do you want to stay in the business? Can we give you some extra help? Is there some marketing we can do for you better? And let's come up with a plan of, stay and improve, or a graceful exit. Two very honorable solutions. The sooner you make that decision, the better off everybody's going to be.
Hey, Joe, I know in preparing the information for the show and discussing things with our guests, you put a lot of effort into it, and I really appreciate it. And as we're slowly creeping up on the top of the hour, I'm going to leave this last question that we have prepared for you.
Well, fantastic, Paul, and thank you for the compliment. Tom, you live in Philadelphia, and Philadelphia is famous for lots of historical figures, but in particular Ben Franklin. And an adage that Ben Franklin commonly used was, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. With regard to franchising, what's appropriate when it comes to business planning and franchisors when they're looking at improving their processes and procedures with leases and lender negotiations? How do they ensure that they're guiding their franchisees but not overreaching and creating any kind of liability? And one of the things that comes to mind, you mentioned earlier LOIs. Is it really appropriate for a franchisor to give a template LOI to the franchisee to use with their commercial broker or their tenant representative?
Yeah, I think it is appropriate. I mean, look, ultimately you're the franchisor, and a lot of franchisors and a lot of attorneys for franchisors get so paranoid about potential future liability that they forget this adage that if you prevent it by a best practice and you do a real good faith effort and a good job of actually getting what needs to get into the documents early on, then you're never going to have that explosion in liability to be worried about. The flip side of the coin, of course, is for the overly conservative folks, is it depends. You have to be the coach as the franchisor, and I think a best practice is to have that bullet point list that we've talked about of what are the most important things for the franchisee to look at. And, where do you get that list? Well, from the IFA and resources and that, and quite frankly, from all your explosions in the past. That's why franchising works, right? You take every mistake you've made in the past and you go back around and fix it. And I think the other side is to have the proper professionals who know your brand. When I was an executive in doing these things, and when I was responsible for getting franchisees funding and getting franchisees lease signs, I had a stable of people. I had 2 or 3 real estate attorneys that I would put on a short list, and I had 2 or 3 banks. Back then it was a lot of banking brokers that I would use, and I would know and teach their professionals what was important to me. So that not only does it give you the right processes in place and you know that they're dealing with a professional who is going to look out for them but is going to be sensitive and understand what are the key deal points for you, it also, from the franchisor protection standpoint, your hands aren't on it last. At the end, they had a financing broker or a bank, or they had an attorney look at their lease in their best interest, but yet it still got in there. So I think having the right professional core of transaction folks, whether they be brokers, whether they be these exclusive relationships, out there looking out for the franchisees, having an independent relationship, so to speak, with a franchisee, or an attorney working with a franchisee, but yet who understands what franchisors need to get. I think that is really the prevention, and it stops them from overreaching. Because you're right, the franchisor shouldn't really be the one negotiating the lease, because it could come down that you're adverse to the franchisee at some point 5 years from now. So you have to be real careful as a franchisor not to be the last one looking at it.
Well, gentlemen, it's been a great show, and we're closing into the last minute of the show. Tom, I really do appreciate you being on the show, and I'd like to extend an offer to come back on the show maybe in the spring.
Fantastic.
We'll discuss,
thanks, Paul.
Things a little bit further, and maybe the economy will be turning in the right direction at that point. Joe, I appreciate all that you do for Franchise Today, and love having you on the show as well. Next week, next Thursday, before I head to West Coast Franchise Expo, We have Michael Webster, franchisee attorney and strategic chair at the International Association of Franchisees and Dealers. He'll be on the show talking about the ABA form on franchising. I think it'll be a great show. Looking forward to it. Until next week, I'm Paul Segreto, wishing you the best, the very best in this great thing we call franchising. Franchise Today is out.
When you're part of a military family, you understand sacrifice and support. At American Public University, we honor your dedication by extending our military tuition savings to your extended family. Parents, spouses, legal partners, siblings, and dependents all qualify for APU's preferred military rate of just $250 per credit hour for undergraduate and master's level programs. American Public University. Value for the whole family. Learn more at apu.apus.edu/military.